Hello and welcome to the Freakish Lemon video podcast. I am your host, the Freakish Lemon. I go by Adrian. I use masculine pronouns. Welcome any new viewers. Thank you so much for clicking on whatever you clicked on to get here. And welcome back any returning viewers. Thank you so much for following along with whatever I happen to be doing. This is a crafty type podcast coming to you from the Northwest Hills of Connecticut. And show notes for this episode and all episodes can be found at freakishlemon.com or freakishlemonpodcast.com. We have a group on Ravelry. Search Freakish Lemon in the Groups tab and you will find us. And you can follow me as Freakish Lemon at all the fun places like Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Ravelry. If I am there as Freakish Lemon. All the links to these things will be in the down bar here on YouTube or somewhere around here if you're watching it somewhere else. And please remember to subscribe here on YouTube if you want to be kept up to date with any videos that I post on this channel. Trip over my words. I'm filming this on Saturday, March 3rd, 2018. And we start this podcast out with a little bit of podcast stuff. 2018 blanket make-along. If you're making a blanket, post about it in the thread on the Ravelry group. Wow, short words I'm just tripping over today. You'll probably hear/see me do a lot of that this episode. But yes, there's a group on Ravelry if you want to share photos, encourage, ask questions about, choices that you need to make about a blanket that you are making. It can be any craft. Feel free to post. And speaking of blankets, March 1st started our half-square triangle quilt-along, which I think there's like 3 people doing. Including me. But if you would like to join us for the half-square triangle quilt-along, the thread is in the Ravelry group. I will be posting the fabrics that I'm using up there soon. I keep making notes to do it and then I don't, because you'll see my craft room is kind of a mess right now. But just a quick rundown of the quilt-along. It's running from March 1st, 2018 to September 30th, whatever the last day in September is. It's 6 months. It's a 6-month quilt-along. Quilt size, the smallest size has to be 3 feet, which is like from my fingertips to here. That's not a really big quilt size. Quilt pattern, you can use any pattern you like or make one up as long as there are half-square triangles in it somewhere. I mean, you could do something as simple as, like a 3x3 half-square triangle thing and then huge borders and you're done, It could be that simple if you really want. But I do have a Pinterest board with some ideas. You can find a link for that in the show notes and in the Ravelry thread. There's no rules about the actual quilting. It could be machine quilt, hand quilt, tie quilt, long arm, whatever you want. And if you are new to quilting, there is a link both in the show notes and Ravelry group to Jacqueline Salem from the Brooklyn Knit Folk podcasts series on how to quilt. She did a quilt-along last year and put together a wonderful tutorial series about how to make a quilt. So if you've never done that before, it's pretty much the same thing, only you're making squares that are half triangles instead of just plain old squares. Like, that's the only difference. And that should be it for podcast stuff. Unless I'm missing something. I don't know. So a little bit of life stuff. The weather has been super weird through the second half of February and first few days of March. It's been alternating between really unusually warm, like summer weather warm and seasonably cold, which for February is below freezing. I don't know. It's doing weird things. Our backyard is a swamp. We're cultivating our swamp moss very well this year. And yesterday we had a nor'easter, which if you're not a person living in the northeast of the United States and probably Canada, it's a type of storm that kind of sweeps up northeast, which usually for this time of year means blizzards, but we just kind of got really heavy wind and some rain. It's very weird. Very, very weird. And the only other thing I have to talk about in life stuff is trying to slow down. I've mentioned it before on this podcast that I'm trying to slow things down to rest my hands, because they're probably not, you know, great, because I have a terrible time of slowing down. I overdo things, always. When I first learned how to spin, I hurt my back drop spindling because I wouldn't stop doing it. So that, you know, that's how I get myself into these situations. So I'm trying to slow it down, making a real effort, which is hard. It does take work to kind of do that kind of thing. So what I'm trying to do is basically 3 things that I'm focusing on. The first is spreading out the crafting. So when I am crafting, doing small moments of activity, 15 minutes, that type of thing, 15, 20 minutes, half hour maybe, depending on the craft. Sewing I can go longer for because it's a lot of this. And if I'm actually at a point to knit on the machine, that I can go a little longer for, because if I'm not hand manipulating the stitches very much, then it's just kind of this motion. But trying to spread it out, trying to do more preparation for things that I am crafting, which previously I didn't really put a whole heck of a lot of thought into my crafts, mostly because knitting and crochet is a fairly slow craft and you can kind of make decisions as you go. Like, you know, I'll figure this out when I get to that point in the pattern, but with machine knitting, with weaving, with quilting, you have to do a lot of preparation. I mean, depending on what you're doing, but there's the potential for a lot of preparation, a lot of planning, so trying to put more time and energy into that. For example, swatching for sweaters on my machine, you know, putting more effort into the swatching process, into the measuring, into figuring out the pattern I want to use, or do I want to just draft a pattern. Putting feelers out into different aspects of the crafts that I already do. What can I do with machine knitting? What can I do with weaving? What are things that I would not have attempted because I was so focused on whatever I was doing at the moment? A lot of thinky thoughts about crafting in between any actual crafting. I've also been trying to read and write more. I mean, it's always a goal of mine whenever I'm trying to set goals, like, oh, I should read more, I should write more. I grew up reading and writing constantly. And then I found other things I was excited about and didn't make time for either of those things. So spread out the crafting, do some more reading, do some more writing, I posted a new fic to my fanfic course correction about a week ago? 2 weeks ago now? I don't know, but that was a good feeling to post a new chapter of a fic. Almost a year after I had last updated it. Oh, that's bad. But, put more time into those things, which are less hand-intensive. Writing is a little more hand-intensive, but, if anybody else out there writes, you know that the last thing a writer is doing is writing. We're usually just sitting around thinking about what we would write if we had the time and the energy and the inspiration to write. So, a lot of writing planning, when typing is not advisable because my hands are sore. And sleeping more. Basically, I'm tired of being tired all the time. That's something that'll eat up your time if, you know, you can't do things. Sleep some. I mean, I say that flippantly, but yeah, I'm just tired of being tired. And I know going to bed at 10:30, 11 o'clock to get up at 5:30 in the morning is not enough time to sleep. So I'm avoiding using overhead lights after dinner. I am trying to read 15 minutes before bed because, let me tell you, it's dark and you're reading a paper book or like my type of Kindle. Where is it? It's here somewhere. I had it just a second ago. There it is. I have I don't know if it has a special name, but it's the kind that doesn't have any backlighting in the screen. It's just the black and white screen. There's no lighting at all. So, you know, reading an actual book or that model of Kindle before bed, it's kind of dark. You fall asleep fairly quickly, even if you're engrossed in what you're reading. Or at least for me. And for the past week and a half, I've been going to bed at around 9. Which has been lovely. And I know I'm lucky that I can do that. I work a steady hour office job, and I have no dependents. I can just go to sleep when I want to go to sleep. But yeah, that's been nice. It is a lot nicer to have that extra almost 2 hours of sleep. That's a really good feeling. And I will note that when I go to bed that early, I do wake up in the middle of the night, but I'm relaxed and I go back to bed pretty quickly. So it's not like disrupting my sleep. It's not like I wake up and can't go back to sleep for 2 hours. I wake up, I go, oh, I'm awake, and I'm back asleep before I realize it. So that's really what I've been doing, sleeping, which is nice. And now we get into the actual crafty bits of the podcast, and we're going to start it off with a finished object. I have one finished object, and that is, I think I've talked about it once before on the podcast, but it is a sample scarf for Gabby from Once Upon a Corgi, who is my sister. So here's the finished scarf. I vaguely remember talking about it, but I can't remember if I talked about it on the podcast or in a post on Instagram. But basically I did a warp using black and white yarn, and I did it in such a way so that you get stripes with the light color being dominant, a light color, a dark color, and then stripes with the dark color being dominant. So that you can see how each of the different yarns would weave up for, this is for a booth sample for her. So they're all Once Upon a Corgi yarns. It's just a straight normal weave. I did fringe twist the ends there. I have a fringe twister. But yeah, I'm not sure I remember all of these colorways, but there's multiple colorways. This is Moon of My Life, Frosted Cranberries, His Name is Shirley, I'm pretty sure I have this one written down somewhere, but I'm not entirely sure which one it is. And if I do have it written down, it's probably on the phone, which I'm filming on. This one is an early Libraries. I'm not entirely sure if it's exactly what she dyes up now, but it's similar to. Pretty sure this is Tower Over the Thames. This is S-O-R-E. I don't remember. I know I asked her about this one, but I don't remember. Because Pumpkin Spice, which I really like as a weave with the stripes. Coconut Cream Cake, Zombie Kangaroo, and Murderer Attempts to Murder Murderer. Some of these are my scraps, some of these are her scraps, and it doesn't take very much yarn to do the weaving for each of these color blocks. It's about an 8-inch block, and there's 6 weft strands of black in between them, just so it's easy to determine which color is which, because I did put some similar colors next to each other. I think the most for the weft I had to use for one of these is a single. That one I had to use more yarn than all the other ones, but it typically used about 3 of those small boat shuttle bobbins that I have, that I got from Webs, which are usually for when you're getting to the end of your weaving and your opening is getting smaller and smaller because you're at the end. But because my loom is very small, I have a 10-inch Cricut loom. That size shuttle goes very easily through it. But that is the Once Upon a Corgi sample scarf, which I had a lot of fun doing. It was really cool to see how each of these yarns interacts with the different type of warp that you would put on a loom. Obviously they're going to look different if you use a different color warp because of how the colors play, but this kind of gives you an idea of what it would look like with other warps that you may choose to do if you are weaving. If there are any other indie dyers which would like a sample scarf, shoot me a message. That was a really fun project, and I'm really into weaving right now, and there's only so many scarves you can make for yourself. That's the only finished object I have for this episode. My works in progress. Sorry, my show notes went to sleep on me. I'm just gonna put up some video here I took of my craft room and what a mess it is. That's what I'm working on. There's a thing on each table, pretty much. My winter wall quilt from the Weekend Quilter book. I've started assembling the rows, but I'm in the middle of it. I'm seaming together my color block weaving project, which, because I'm taking it slow, is going slowly. And I'm nearly done with the ribbed cuff of one sleeve on my Tremontaine sweater by Amy Herzog, which I am doing on my LK150 with my own handspun and some classical yarns, Mohawk wool in black. and I got the pattern from her custom fit site with my measurements and a gauge swatch. So that's really the handcrafts that are sitting around being worked on, but I've got plenty more to talk about in this podcast because I don't know how to shut up when I'm talking to a camera alone. Last weekend, I decided to have a dye adventure day. I talked about it on Instagram. I'm not sure if I mentioned it on the podcast because it's been about 3 weeks since my last podcast episode. But I went through a few weekends ago, I went through my yarn stash and my fabric stash. I made sure my yarn stash had everything on Ravelry, and I made sure my fabric stash was organized by color type and print type. So all the solids are in one bin, all the prints are in another, the Star Wars is in its own bin, the Halloween is in its own bin, that kind of thing. And I found a bunch of fabrics that I don't like or don't like anymore. Most of them are actually fabrics that were a part of my grandma's stash and somehow ended up in my stash. I don't know if they were ones that I had grabbed from her stash at one point, or if they just kind of migrated through a few people's stashes before they got to me. And some salvaged fabric from some old curtains that used to be in here, and that kind of thing. So I bought a book on Amazon for the Kindle called Fabric to Dye For. Create 72 hand-dyed colors for your stash. 5 fused quilt projects by Frida Anderson. It's a very what's the word I'm looking for? Beginner-friendly look into dyeing cotton, linen, plant-based fabrics. The book actually specifically says that this is not an exact guide. You're not going to get exact colors because this is for home dyers using measurements like cups of water, tablespoons of dye powder. It's not going to be precise. And the book actually takes you through, the way the book is designed is to have you buy a certain yardage of white cotton fabric, cut it into fat quarters, and takes you through how to dye primary colors, the secondary colors, the tertiary colors, and then the lighter versions of all those colors, and the darker versions of all those colors. How to take two colors that you know how to dye and dye a gradient between them. And then with some chapters about hand painting or resist dyes, that kind of thing. But the goal is to have basically a set of rainbow fat quarters in different shades, tones, color types that you can use for quilting. And then there's some quilting projects that use those at the end of the book. And I found it really easy to understand method of learning the basics of dyeing fabric, which I think honestly may be a little bit more user-friendly than dyeing animal fibers like yarn. Because you don't need as much heat. In fact, you only ever need hot water at one time, and that's to mix your dye. And I don't know the Celsius measurement for this, but it only has to be 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which I can get a hotter water out of the hot water tap in the kitchen sink. So you don't need a stove, you can do it outside. You know, if you bring the hot water out with you, it's really simple to do. I think it would be a fun thing to do during the summer where you can just lay your fabrics out to dry afterwards if you have a place to do that, or a clothesline or whatever. So I used the Dharma Trading Company Procyon dyes for plant-based fabrics, and I only bought the primary colors in black because that's what the book teaches you how to use, which is really helpful because that means less money you have to spend. I did buy much more dye than I needed, but, you know, one of these days I'd like to actually go through that book and actually get all the fat quarters in that range of colors just to see how they turn out when I do them. That would be super cool. But I just played around with over dyeing last weekend, which I did in about an hour and a half. Because for fabrics, basically you mix your dye stock, you mix your water, you pour it over the fabrics that you want to dye, you squish all the fabric and the dye, make sure it's all integrated, which I did not do as well as I should have. And then you let it sit for 2 to 24 hours. So I just left them overnight, and then it's washing, rinsing, drying, ironing. So all the dyeing actually got done within an hour and a half, which was fantastic. And here are the results. Most of them are great. Some of them need some tweaking. One of them is atrocious. I'm going to show you the atrocious one first, but I think it's probably just the nature of this fabric. So this is the original fabric. It's not a fabric I like, and I didn't have very much of it left, so I figured it would be a good experiment to dye with. I put this in purple dye, which I did half red, half blue. It wasn't, it was just a straight purple. And this is the horrendous result. Actually, it doesn't look too bad on camera, but let me tell you, it is super ugly in person. It's ugly. Like a little darker than that, and that's true to life. It's super ugly. And I think most of it is because of this pattern and how this pattern was dyed onto the fabric to begin with. This was a part of a cheap fat quarter set that I got at Joann's ages ago. So this is atrocious, but I'm still going to use the fabric because look at the back. That's pretty beautiful. You can see where the dye kind of split and you have more blue over here than purple, and you have some more of it there. But I really like how this fabric looks on the back. Oh, you should also note, when I dyed these, you need to put them in a container that you're never going to use for food to set overnight. The book recommends, like, you know, just plastic, like Gladware, Tupperware type things. I used, because of the amounts of fabric I have, I used dollar store roasting tins, those aluminum roasting tins, and because of the way those are designed, they're designed so that the grease will sink to the bottom and not touch the meat. I mean, it's like a ½ an inch between the ridges and the meat. But that did affect how my dye set on the fabric because some parts of it were sitting in dye and some parts were not. So, just so you know, probably some of the splotchiness comes from how I had the fabrics resting in the container. I would like to see how they turn out, how a new batch of fabric would turn out in a flat-bottomed container. So I'm definitely going to try that fat quarter experiment and do them in a flat container and see if I get a more even spread of color. And then there's this fabric that I dyed. It's, you know, it's not that I hated it, it's just, it's showing a kind of orange here. It's not orange, it's a red, but it's a light red that didn't go with any of the other red fabrics I have. My red fabrics tend to be dark red, like a just slightly darker than this. I put this fabric in a gray dye bath, so I did half the black dye that you would do to dye something black, and I like how that came out. These all came out a little bit batik, if you're familiar with that type of fabric, because of the thing they were sitting in. So you do still have some of the red, but it's mostly this kind of burgundy with the black. You can see it's not an even dye, but, you know, for quilting fabric, that's fine. So that's the difference between those, which is a big difference. This fabric, there wasn't much difference, but I do like the new fabric better. So this is the old fabric. Again, it's a red that's not red enough to go with my other reds. And I think this fabric also definitely came from my grandma's stash, because I'm pretty sure there's parts of it that have smoke stains on them. It was more than 10 years ago, I think, but there was a house fire at my grandma's house, and we ended up with a lot of her fabric to wash, and I think some of it just stayed with us accidentally, but she'll never miss it because she has a basement full of fabric. So there was some smoke damage to the fabric where it stained it, where the fabric was folded over and visible. But you'd never know now because I've over-dyed it, which you can barely tell that I've over-dyed it. You can only really tell when I put them right up next to each other that it's a darker red than the original. But I do, even though the difference is very slight, I do like the difference between these. So that's that. And then I had this orange fabric, which was fine, but not orange enough. This camera's making it really orange because of how this camera films, but it's just not orange enough. The oranges I have in my fabric stash are either bright in your face Halloween orange or burnt orange from the 70s. In between, this orange, to me, it's wishy-washy, and I don't like it. It doesn't know whether it wants to be bright or dull. And I don't think having the kind of red lines in it helps. So, I overdyed this with red. I did some really basic overdyes. And this is looking red on the screen, but it's more like a blood orange color, which is really nice. Like, it's definitely a red, but it's leaning towards orange, which is really satisfying. And you can definitely see some of the orange peeking through on this one. I think this one got the best coverage of dye, but you still get some really interesting little sections where the dye didn't take as well, or didn't settle as well. Put that over there. And then this is another one. It's not that I didn't like this fabric, I just couldn't see it going with anything else in my fabric stash. So I wanted to make it something that would go with other fabrics. I don't think I succeeded. This one's going to be getting an overdye. I overdyed this one purple. because I have seen some really nice purpley browns in fabric before. But you can see where the dye split is really terrible, and it's uneven coverage. You can see where it was resting in the dye and where it wasn't. It's pretty bad. So this is gonna get a gray overwash. And if that doesn't work, it's gonna get dyed black. That's the beauty of over dye. Eventually you'll just make it black if you keep dyeing it. And I can always use a black fabric, especially with my multitude of Halloween quilts. And then this is a green that I just wasn't feeling it anymore. It's not quite a shade. It's on my screen, it's coming up more of like an Irish green, but it's more of a gray than what I'm seeing on the phone right now. But I just overdyed this with green, half blue, half yellow dye. And oh no, this is the one I overdyed with just blue. And this is the color, which is much more of a color that I like. You can tell on the back because of the way the dye, this original fabric was dyed basically on one side, so the back is bright blue where I dyed it, and this was just a fat quarter, so you can see the whole thing. Again, you can see the coverage is uneven, but for quilting, I don't think that's going to be a problem. But I really like the blue over this green. Because even where the dye didn't hold very much, it's a better green than the original one, in my opinion. And then this is another green. It's not that I didn't like this green, it just didn't go with anything in my fabric stash. It was just all by its lonesome. And pretty sure this is from Grandma's stash. So this one I overdyed with green. Half blue, half yellow dye. And this is what it came up as. It's showing a little bit more blue on my camera. But just darkened it up and made it a much more saturated color. I tend to use very saturated colors in fabric for quilts. I'm learning. Alright, this next one was interesting. This is a purple. I have so much purple fabric. That's why I did a purple Hawkeye quilt. I have so much purple fabric. This purple went with none of the other purples. None of them. I couldn't even use this in my Hawkeye quilt. And I had 2 cuts of this. So I did an experiment to see how this purple would take dyes that were different colors. So I did one black, the gray over dye, which turned it this kind of really nice kind of space looking mottled fabric. You can see it didn't really cover there. You can see that the dye kind of, well, it's kind of blue there. That might have been because when I was washing and rinsing it, I might have left it touching some blue for a little bit too long, but that's fine. That's why I washed all those dark ones together. Just in case that happened. But it's a really beautiful fabric that I'm really excited to use now. And then the other cut of it, I overdyed with red. So it's basically just a pinky red. You can see some of where the dye didn't dissolve properly. There's actually some... Penny gonna howl? That dog must be asleep. She usually howls when sirens go off. But there's actually a little bit of yellow there where I think I didn't wash a spoon well enough. And yeah, there's still portions where you can see some of that purple coming through, but I think this is a very usable kind of magenta red. So two very different overdyes of the same fabric, which is super great. And then I had this kind of lavender cotton left over from the Hawkeye quilts. I had, I think, a yard of it left, and I was just kind of sick of seeing this color in my stash. So I overdyed this with blue. And this is showing up much brighter on screen than it is in real life. It's kind of a periwinkle-ish blue. It's definitely got purple undertones in the blue. The camera's not showing the kind of undertones that I'm seeing in real life right now. I think it's a little blown out. Is there a section where the dye didn't reach, where you can see it? No, I don't think the camera's going to show you the actual tones in this. But it's a very nice blue, very usable. I don't know if I currently have anything that would really go with it, like really well, but it would be definitely a great contrast with black and white, if nothing else. So that's that. And then the bulk of the dyeing was into these 3-yard cuts of this green plaid. And it's not that I don't like this green plaid. These were my curtains in this bedroom for a long time. They are sun faded, they are stained, they are kind of a mess. I have used one panel of this, one and a bit off the end of one of the other ones, for a cushion for my folding chair and for the backs to all my practice free motion quilt squares. But I'm working on that winter wall quilt for this bed, and I may need a border, and I currently don't have any fabric chosen for the border. I figured if I could overdye this in the correct type of blue, I could use up a bunch of that fabric on border. First go round is not the right type of blue. This was just straight blue, and it's very blue. Very blue. It's kind of searingly blue. You can still see a little bit of the green in there, but it's the tone, the colors are too close to each other, so it just kind of looks weird right now. And that's throughout, even in the sun faded spots. Or except for one of these. One of these has a really big spot on it that's so sun faded there's barely any plaid anymore. But these definitely need another overdye. I'm gonna do another, I'm gonna take this and that purpley brown flowers and do the half amount black overdye. So this is more, if this ends up more of like a denim to black color, then I can definitely use it in my quilt. But we'll see what happens when I overdye it again. And I will show you guys the results of that when I get them. But that's the difference. It's really, dyeing is so interesting. But yeah, if you're a person who uses fabric and you've got a place to play around with some dye, it's super fun. Highly recommend it. Definitely going to be doing some more of it. Sorry for adjusting. Ugh. There we go. Fabric. Talked about it. Now I can get it out of the way. Get out of here. Okay. And then I'm going to make this podcast 50 times longer than it needs to be. I know it. I wanted to do a bit of a roundup of my works in progress that are on needles and hooks, and what I'm going to be doing with them, since I haven't really been able to hand knit all that much. So the first one I'm going to talk about is my Rice Fields shawl in this Halloween bag I made using Halloween colorways from Legacy Fiber Arts and some Barocco something or other. Do I have it written down? Barocco Ultra Alpaca Light. So this is as far as I got. And it's frankly annoying me that I have projects like this just sitting around because it currently hurts to knit. Or it doesn't hurt to knit, it's my hands hurt afterwards. While I'm knitting, it doesn't hurt. Then the next day, they're awful. Because I've done something to them. So, I'm gonna rip this out. This poor yarn has been 2 shawls that I started now. But I need yarn for my Shawl Shapes machine knit project. And I want to do, I'll talk about it some more. So this is gonna get ripped out and used in a machine knit shawl project. This weight will finally be a shawl. This poor yarn has been 2 shawls that sat around for about a year. Well, this shawl hasn't been sitting for a year, but the previous shawl that it was trying to be sat around for a year as like this much of a shawl. So that's just a shame. So I'm gonna rip that out, turn it into a machine knit shawl project. So at least it gets to be a project, and then I can wear it around. My Marled Magic shawl by Stephen West. Oh, I forgot to name. The pattern designer for the Rice Field shawl is Elzbieta Torenk. Link is in the show notes. This project bag, this Avengers project bag, has yarn for the Marled Magic shawl by Stephen West, which looks like this. Also not very far. I'm gonna rip it out. This will also be used, since it's all scraps and some old hand spun, this will also be used in a Shawl Shapes machine knit project. I've also done the math on the Marled Magic shawl, and I can knit that on the LK150 if I do the smaller version, which is still a pretty big shawl. I don't know if anybody that I watch on podcasts has done the bigger version of the shawl, but I can still make that shawl on the machine. It would take a lot of hand manipulated stitches, but I could do it. I have enough needles to do it. So whatever's left from this may be turned into that. I don't know, but I like how this looks, and I want it to be a thing that I can actually wear around. So this is gonna get frogged. The biggest one, my Akiko sweater in my Star Wars duffel bag that I made, which I had knit top down all the way down to the bottom ribbing, and is probably the reason that my hands are so screwed up, because this is a project I was working on when they hurt. Not the project that probably pushed me over the edge, but this is the one where I wouldn't stop to rest my hands, because I kept knitting on it when I should have been resting my hands. But this, as much as it's annoying that I put so much work into this, I'm probably gonna frog it. It's Lion Brand yarn, Lion Brand Scarfy. I'm pretty sure this weight, yeah, this weight will definitely fit on my LK150. And I'm making a really basic sweater, which is really easy to do on the LK150. So, in order to make this yarn a sweater, I'm going to rip this back and make a sweater on the LK150. The LK150 sweater will probably be a little different. For this yarn, for this sweater, when I was making this sweater, I wanted a big, comfy sweater. I'm probably going to marl it more so that it's less of a gradient and more of a marly, stripy thing. I'm probably not going to do ribbed cuffs, neck, and waistband. I'm probably just going to do a rolled hem so that this is a quick and easy, comfy knit on my machine. Because this was going to be a big, comfy, easy knit on the needles. So instead of letting it sit here, and probably by the time I can knit again, my gauge will have changed because I won't have been hand knitting. The sleeves are going to look funny on this anyway, so I'm going to, once I have some time to put a thing on the machine, because I've got a lot of projects planned for this knitting machine. Or I have to get some more machines. It's kind of what happens when you start being a machine knitter. You start collecting machines. But yeah, instead of letting this languish, I'm gonna rip it out. It's not precious yarn. It's not a project that I really desperately wanted. I just wanted a big comfy sweater. Which I didn't. I did a big comfy sweater in 3 weeks on my knitting machine when I first got it. At like the height of hand pain. So I'm probably gonna rip it back. Get that out of the way. Am I in focus? Maybe. Okay. My Gin Urso vanilla socks. Which is one sock like this. Just a tube. It's gonna stay a tube for now. But I get the feeling I'm gonna rip it out. Because I've been itching to buy a circular sock machine. I have a ton of Star Wars self-striping yarn from Mustache Yarns. And other Star Wars self-striping yarn. And circular sock machines look so fun. And I never do patterns on my self-striping socks anyway. So it depends on the speed at which I either get back to hand knitting or get a circular sock machine. My first pair of socks probably won't be one of these on a circular sock machine. I'll probably just take some spare yarn from something and just make test socks for a bit, but once I figure out the machine, which I really want to do, I'm probably going to rip this back and just knit some socks on the knitting machine. But I've left socks on the needles before for ages, depending on what I was working on, so that doesn't bother me. And they're small and they can be hidden away. So, and then the Dwarven Mittens by Ginger Monkey Knits. These have been my knitting project that I gauge whether or not I can knit again on. And I've done a lot of little bits of knitting, which has resulted in 2 mittens without thumbs. you can tell the gauge is slightly different between them, especially in the cuff. This is the sock that the mitten I have been working on when I've thought I could knit and then my hands hurt and then I stopped knitting. So I'm not gonna rip these out. I really want these mittens. I love this yarn. I love this pattern. The only thing left to do is the thumbs. So I'm probably just gonna ask Gabby to finish the thumbs for me. So Gabby, if you're watching, can you finish my thumbs for me? It's worsted weight yarn. It's gonna be like 12 rows each. I don't have very long thumbs. So I'll probably ask her next time she's up. You know, just, can you finish my thumbs? That's all I need done. Because once the thumbs are knit, and I think in the pattern it calls for like 17 rows, but I don't think I need them that long. Like this one has 2 rows on it already. And if we put it on the hand, it's actually supposed to go on. Yeah, I could actually probably use some decreases already. And then like 10 rows and some decreases. So I would ask my mom to finish them, but my mom has such a tight gauge that it would not work. I feel like the difference between my gauge and Gabby's gauge can be fudged in the thumbs on a mitten. So hopefully those will be a finished object. Joint effort, but a finished object. I didn't grab it, but my Granny Stripes blanket, which is a crochet blanket using the pattern / tutorial from Lucy of the Attic 24 blog. I'm gonna leave that where it is. I'm used to leaving crochet blankets. Right now it's like 1.5 rows of Granny Stripe. That's not a big deal for me to leave in a tote bag hanging on a hook of my closet door. If I feel the need to use the scrap yarns that are in there, I will use them. It's not like I'm ever going to run out of scrap yarn. That would be crazy. So that's fine to stay where it is. Similarly, my my Cozy Memories blanket, which I was really getting into before I hurt my hands. Which it's currently not really usable as anything else, unless I wanted to just rip down to the 3 rows and have a scarf. It's gonna hibernate for a while. I'm probably gonna put it in a smaller bag to just store it away. And in the meantime, I'm going to be using these scraps when I have a chance and there's nothing on my machine. So many projects to put on the machine. I'd like to play around with adapting the pinwheel stripes. Oh my god. Pinwheel scrap blanket by Mina Phillip, the knitting expat, into stockinette stitch on my machine. I feel like it would be super easy to adapt since I'm pretty sure it's just using short rows. And for a bunch of it, I could even seam it on the machine. Not all of it, because eventually you'd run out, or run out of needles, but you could do like 4x4 squares, I would think. Maybe even 3x3, depending on how big the squares end up. I think that would be really fun to play around with on the machine. See, that's the thing with the machines. You get to play around with so much stuff. Like, even if you could do it on the machine, the way it's written, like, you could do garter stitch short rows on the machine. It would be a pain, but you could do it. But the machine makes you think, like, how could I make this easier on myself? And it's just really fun to think about the things I could put on the machine. So probably a bunch of these scraps will go into a pinwheel scrap blanket, which would be really fun to be like the smaller projects I do between bigger pieces. Because you'll have noticed that every time I finish a piece on the machine, I have like a dozen swatches. That would be a good thing to have this just sitting next to the machine and do like a few squares of that blanket and then do another piece of a sweater. Like, that would be really cool. And then one other work in progress, which I never talk about, but I have this bag of these small granny squares that I would periodically make out of just scrap acrylic yarns. I have enough squares here that I can make a pleasing rectangle. I have 130 squares. 10 by 13 is a pleasing rectangle, but it's not a very big rectangle because these are tiny granny squares. So what I'm gonna do is, one of the things I'm gonna do to practice using my garter bar on my knitting machine is to do log cabin borders on these squares, which I think would look really cool. And I have a ton of acrylic scrap yarn. So, kind of joint crochet knitting project, a way to learn something, or, you know, I know how to do garter on the machine with the garter bar. I've done a swatch, but like a way to work on that technique in a way that makes something really cool. So that's what I'm doing with my works in progress. Hibernating, ripping, and converting things to machine. And this is going to be a really long podcast because I got more stuff to talk about. Oh man. Because part of the things I wanted to talk about my shawl shapes for machine knitting design project. Because I am talking about ripping out some of my current shawls to use for the shawl shapes design. So, let me drag over my cube of shawl shape design things. So I've figured out swatches and one shawl for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shawl shapes. The first of which is the asymmetrical shawl, which if you've ever knit an asymmetrical shawl before, seems like the most obvious one for machine knitting, except for like a rectangle shawl. But I figure you can make a rectangle on the knitting machine. You can figure that out. But I had done the first one, and these are basically going to be plain stockinette. I'm going to do 2 versions of each shawl in different weights of yarn. Because it's really easy to knit different weights of yarn on a knitting machine. But I'm going to do something slightly different with the second of the shawls. So one will be plain stockinette, and one will have something added to it. So this is the asymmetrical shawl that I've shown you before out of my Halloween worsted weight yarns with the Plymouth Galway rows of black in between so that I didn't get weird color pooling or anything. So this is a pretty typical asymmetrical shawl. Stockinette. I mean, the edges roll. Asymmetrical shawls kind of roll anyway because of how they're knit, unless they're garter, but stockinette is going to roll like that, which is fine. I have 2 hand knit asymmetrical shawls that roll like this. So that's the first one. And so I'm also going to do one in this, I'm not sure whether this is technically a lace weight or a fingering weight. It's kind of in between. But I have 3 balls of this Zeolana yarn, which is 40% New Zealand merino, 30% organic cotton, and 30% possum, that I got on a sidewalk sale at my local yarn store. So I have 3 of these. So I'm going to do an asymmetrical shawl with these. I'm thinking maybe I'll do a simple cable along a side. Oops, flinging this. Like just a 2x2 twist over cable. But, you know, a worsted weight and this weight of yarn are very different. And to show that you can do both on a mid-gauge machine would be super cool. So that's that project. And then with my recent swatches, pretty sure I showed you both of them. Or did I? I don't know. Last time I had room on the machine, I did some swatches for a sideways equal triangular shawl using increases and decreases. This is the first one. This is way too long and skinny for my preference. But I can definitely add in the directions for how to do this in the machine knitting thing. So I did this one, which I like a lot better. This looks like your typical triangular shawl. If I can arrange my fingers so that I can stretch. It's acrylic yarn. It's not going to block out. I didn't want to melt it with my iron. So triangular shawl. And I think I'm going to do one big one in this Cascade Eco Wool. I have a bunch of this brown Cascade Eco Wool that was salvaged from somebody else's project that gave it to somebody else who sent it to me. I have a bunch of it. I might not end up using this yarn, but I think having a giant, just brown shawl to basically wear as a blanket would be great. So that's going to be the straight stockinette version. Wake up, little show notes device, and then the variation is going to be an intarsia one, because I have an intarsia carriage from my machine. And I really want to showcase this yarn. I'm going to use this Fresh from the Cauldron fingering weight skein. It's radioactive. It's a graduated skein, so like a gradient. So it's basically going to be a triangle shawl with this, with black borders on either side. So you'll start it at the beginning with black, and then the black will split, and in the middle will be this, which I think will be really cool. And this is just some Knit Picks palette fingering weight. I think that will look really, really cool and really showcase that really cool yarn. And then, oh, I'm reading my show notes out of order. And then I have, good job me, what I'm calling the half and half triangle shawl, where you make two triangular pieces and you seam them together. As in this swatch, which I think was a really cool way to use two different yarns. So this is going to be the variation, but it's the one that I picked first. It's Fresh from the Cauldron again, the graduated skeins, Painting the Roses Red, and Valerian. And this will be a border. I'm going to do an I-cord kind of edging along what would be the bottom of the triangle. And then the quote-unquote normal one is going to be this yarn that I forgot that I owned. It's Knitology by Knit Crate. I think this was somebody's D-stash that I ended up with in the colorway Groovy. So I have two skeins of it, so one each, and then I'll do the I-cord border. And then there's a 3-piece shawl. I'm not sure what shape this shawl will ultimately end up being. This is the shape of the swatch, but I don't know what it will look like once it's bigger. Probably a similar shape, but I don't know how like rounded it will be. So possibly a crescent-ish shaped shawl, or just a trapezoid. I've decided to use, I was gonna destash this yarn, then I had an idea. So I'm going to use these skeins of Jagger Spun. It's a lace weight. I need to do some swatches to see what the lace weight will actually look like on my machine. So it will either be lace weight or lace weight held double. And then with a knit-on border, just a simple knit-on border using this gray. It's all the same base of yarn. It's wool silk, and I think that would be a really great use of that yarn. And then this is the project that my Legacy Fiber Arts yarns will also become. I'm going to stripe the Barocco Ultra Alpaca and the Legacy Fiber Arts yarns. So it'll be black and Spellbook on one, black and Mary Sanderson on one, black and Winnie Sanderson on the other, and then a black edging on it. So that'll be the variation on this one. And then the last shape is the half circle using short row wedges, which I'm going to use my what's it called? Marled Magic Shawl yarns on. So I'm going to hold that double, similar marling, and do the shawl shapes there. I haven't decided what yarns I'm going to use for the variation, because the variation on this is not going to be a difference to the actual pattern at all. What I'm going to do is the marled yarns are going to be a straight semicircular wedge shape. And the next one I want to do, I haven't decided if I'm going to buy yarn for it or if I'm going to use something from my stash or what. I don't know if I have enough stuff in my stash. Well, maybe I could do the black and red gradient. That's an idea. But I want to do more than the 5 wedges, because you get a semicircle with 5 wedges, but I want to do maybe 8 wedges to be kind of like a cape. That would be really cool. So that's my ideas. I've gotten enough swatches and yarn picked out that I'm really excited about this project now. And as soon as my sweater is off the machine, I'm going to be making a bunch of shawls, like, really quickly, because most of them are going to be really quick knits that require seaming. So that'll be fun. So real quick, I just want to talk a little bit about some new stuff. You'll notice in my video of my works in progress / craft room mess that I have a new ball winder. I did buy a Strouch Jumbo ball winder. My Knit Picks ball winder, which has been very faithful and has wound many a skein of yarn, was starting to skip. Enough so that it was noticeable. It wasn't one every 3 skeins of yarn. It was several times during winding one skein of yarn. And I've read a lot of, you know, posts about what's the best ball winder to have, and that's a complaint that people have, is when it starts to wear out, it just starts skipping and then ends up wearing itself out. So I still have that one laying around. I haven't decided where it's going to end up yet, whether it's going straight in the recycling or I don't know, but I haven't actually used my Strouch Jumbo ball winder, but I have, you know, set everything up and wound on it a little bit just to get the feel for it. And I like the feel for it right now. And I put in the money for that one because I want something that's going to last me a long time. I paid off my student loan, so I have a little bit of extra cash hanging around while I'm saving money to do things as an adult. And I've got some really big oversized skeins that I need to wind up. So that seemed like the best option for those 3 parameters. I also got a new book that I'm kind of obsessed with right now, which is Card Weaving by Candace Crockett. I read it cover to cover the day I received it. And I keep thinking about it. I keep thinking about it and going back in to read it. I don't remember how I learned about card weaving. How did I learn about card weaving? Oh, I was looking at Stitch's classes. Because there are not solid plans, but one day me and Mom and Gabs would like to go back to Stitch's Midwest, since we have a lot of fiber friends out that way. So I think I was looking at the Stitch's Midwest classes, and I saw a listing for card weaving. I'm like, what is that? So I did a Google and I looked at a bunch of things, and I found a really educational webpage. You'll probably find it if you Google tablet weaving or card weaving. It's not a very high tech, but you'll know it when you see it, and it had recommendations at the bottom for this book if you wanted to get into the practicalities of card weaving, and then another book if you want to go into the history of it. But this book gives you a taste of that history, like where card weaving is a tradition and what those bands are used for and how sturdy they are, and I'm kind of obsessed. Kind of obsessed. So I've made a couple of purchases, and one of the items came in. It is this tiny little weaving shuttle. It's got a flat side on one side and more of a tapered side on the other. And this I bought from Windhaven Fiber Tools. And I do have weaving cards coming in the mail. I could have made weaving cards. As you can tell from this, these are the cards. You can use something as similar weight as a playing card, and that would work fine. In fact, you can see a lot of people using playing cards as weaving cards, like in YouTube videos and things. But there's this one store in Poland on Etsy. They're called Folktales PI on Etsy. And they do these magnificent Gothic woodwork things. And I've been tempted to buy things from their site so many times. But it's always been stuff, it's always like, if you go to their site, you'll see that, like, the weird little cabinet, or like the lantern. It's like, what am I gonna do with that? Nothing. It's gonna sit and gather spiders, is what it's gonna do. But they do have wooden card weaving cards. So I'm like, there we go. That's my excuse to buy from them, because I love their stuff and I want to support them. So I bought some card weaving cards, but they're on their way from Poland. So, so it's gonna take a little bit, but I have this ready. And to start with, I'm just going to do, you can do card weaving on an Inkle loom, if you want to Google that, I-N-K-L-E. But I'm not going to buy a loom to start with. I'm just going to do the backstrapping method. You can also Google, or maybe I have a picture of how that works here in this book. Let's do a quick look through. quick. Do we have an example? No, we just have a bajillion beautiful patterns, which I'm not showing you, which is a crime. Nope, no pictures of that. But I'm super excited. I mean, I'm so excited to weave these ram's horns. They're so cool. And if you are interested at all in card weaving, get this book. Find a copy at your local library, if they have one. Buy it if you have to. Because it's super inspiring and it teaches you how to read and create the patterns for this type of weaving, which is super easy. And you can do it in Excel or Google Sheets really easily. Super awesome. I also bought, which you can't see because it's on my Kindle, a digital copy of Knitting Pattern Essentials, Adapting and Drafting Knitting Patterns for Great Knitwear by Sally Melville. I've been listening to the Hand E Machine Knitting podcast a lot, and oh my god, I've forgotten what her name is. The host of the show does interviews with machine knitters, and she found out that Sally Melville has been a machine knitter, and she did this great impromptu interview with Sally Melville, actually in the back of a car on the way to the airport, about knitting machines, about knitting sweaters, about adapting hand knit patterns for machines, about adapting patterns to fit you. And they were talking about her book, this book, and it sounded like a really great resource to be able to understand how knitting patterns work for sweaters in particular, how to do the math, and how to adapt something from one source to another. So in the book, Sally Melville teaches you how to adapt a sweater pattern from an existing store-bought sweater that fits you well. But I imagine you could also use it to adapt a hand knitting pattern to, say, hand knitting seamless in the round sweater to a knit flat machine knit sweater, or a way to adapt, say, a pattern you really like that's in a top-down raglan, but you want to do it as a bottom-up pieced sweater with drop shoulder, or with cap sleeve, or with saddle shoulder, which I'm really excited to play around with. But I'm thinking this might be what I'm going to use to draft out the pattern for my faded sweater, because I'll be doing the math already, so then I can just figure out where all my color changes need to be, which would be really awesome. So I am reading that book and I am really into it. I'm really into all the thinking about the projects and the planning so that I can get precisely what I want and economize the work that I'm doing. Because if I know what I'm supposed to end up with, then the work getting there is worth it, and may not have to redo it 50,000 times. Maybe only 2 or 3 times. Which finally brings us to other stuff, and I'll try to keep it a little bit short. Stuff I'm watching. Went and saw Black Panther opening weekend. Loved it. Go see it if you haven't. And I've also started watching Frontier on Netflix, which is a historical drama show starring Jason Momoa. Takes place in the Hudson Bay area shortly after the Revolutionary War in the in the United States of America. Lots of fighty and historical politics and Jason Momoa jumping out of dark places to scare Europeans. That's been a running theme. Even his Irish buddy there, he'll just loom out of the shadows just to watch him have a heart attack. It's delightful. Yeah, if you're not into violence in your TV shows, don't watch it, but I'm having a good time with it so far. Stuff I'm listening to, as I said, listening to a lot of the Handy Machine Knitting podcast, which is really good, and you should totally check it out if you have any interest in machine knitting. And I re-listened to Star Wars Clone Wars Wild Space by Karen Miller, narrated by Jeff Gerner, because I love that book with all of my soul. And I had a fic idea, so I had to listen to the book again. It's a thing. And then fanfic. I've been reading a lot of it, but I've chosen a few to talk about. The first one is called Home We'll Go by Appalachian Fireflies. And the summary is a snippet from the fic, so I'm just gonna read that little snippet. I don't know how, Remus stuttered as Molly dropped the infant into his arms, who immediately ceased crying and stared up at him with wide eyes. Nonsense, Molly said. Be a dear and keep him from falling while I feed Ginny. Bah, Ron giggled and slapped Remus in the face. Molly is the emergency contact for the order when those listed can no longer be reached. Remus's life finds a different path. Awesome fic. It's a shorter one. It's 3 chapters. But it's an awesome look at Remus's life after the death of the Potters and what his life must have looked like without Sirius, without James, without Lily, without Peter. It has the Weasleys being super amazing by basically running interference on his life because all of Remus's emergency contacts are no longer available. And so Molly Weasley gets called in after a full moon, when he can't take care of himself after a full moon. And so he stays with them at the Burrow for a while. You know, until he can get back up on his feet. So Molly says. He's ready to go after like 24 hours, but she's like, no, you've got nowhere to go, child. No, you stay here with my multitude of children. It's not like I don't need an extra set of eyes. And then just how events in Remus's life go differently because Molly and Arthur are there to help him when he would have been homeless and destitute otherwise. And then there's this fic that I read called Simple by I Gave You Fair Warning, which is a wonderful username and accurate. The summary for this fic is, Obi-Wan Kenobi saved Qui-Gon that day in the Theed Generator Complex, but it came at a terrible price. In this fic, Obi-Wan uses Force healing to heal Qui-Gon, but he's not a healer, he does not have the training for it, and he ends up causing himself permanent, irreparable brain damage. He can speak in short sentences, he can feed himself, clothe himself, he can keep his quarters tidy, he can still use the Force. His body knows the katas, the training, he can still do a lot of physical tasks, but he can no longer speak in full sentences. His brain is not capable of making complex intuitive leaps. Things have to be explained to him. He can't be around people who are feeling strong negative emotions because his brain is no longer capable of shielding that part of his brain, and he just feels it very intensely. It's an incredible fic. It deals with Obi-Wan coming to terms with the limits of the damage done to his brain, and his new lifestyle. Qui-Gon's inability to accept what's happened to Obi-Wan. It's a very... Qui-Gon's reaction is very Qui-Gon. It's... If you've ever read the Jedi Apprentice books or listened to me ramble about the Jedi Apprentice books for hours, it's very Qui-Gon. His first instinct is always to buckle down, go depressive, and just throw himself into the most dangerous place imaginable and just leave. He's a runner. He runs from his problems. And so he can't accept what's happened to Obi-Wan, and he just leaves. And Anakin's steadfast defense of a friend who made him feel welcome in a strange new place as a child, and who he is constantly defending from people who don't understand, and a lot of how the temple kind of helps Obi-Wan when he needs it. It's a really, really good fic, but I'm warning you, it is a very, very sad fic. It is incredibly sad because the events in Star Wars change because of Obi-Wan's injury. Because he's no longer a part of these events, the way the events unfold change, but it's still a tragedy. Palpatine's still the Chancellor. Order 66 still goes through. There's still a march on the Jedi Temple. It is an extremely sad ending to this fic, but it is a really satisfying alternate telling of the relationships of these Jedi and how the war changes these Jedi, and it's just told from a different way because of what has happened to one of our main characters. It's really, really good. I didn't read too many other fics by this author because a lot of them were really sad or really disturbing, but one of them that, with not unheard of in that universe, torture, capture, slavery, that kind of stuff, heavy topics. I didn't really want heavy topics, but I did read this other fic by this author called Who Are You? Again by I Gave You Fair Warning, and the summary is, Obi-Wan insists he knows what the hell is going on. The only problem is, none of it matches. And Anakin's just as sure he's wrong. No, he's more sure. And it's an amnesia fic. Something happens to Obi-Wan, and this is during the Clone Wars, but Anakin finds him terrified, just like in the wilderness after being separated from him, and he thinks he's 13. He thinks he's on a training mission with Qui-Gon where he falls into a pit and gets eaten by fire beetles. Which is a thing that they talk about in the Clone Wars Wild Space book that I was re-listening to. And he's scared. He's scared of the Clone Wars, what's happening, how the universe feels with the changes that are happening to the Jedi. It frightens him, and he doesn't trust Anakin. He can sense the darkness that's been kind of brewing in the back of Anakin's mind since he murdered the Tusken Raiders, and it terrifies him, and it gives Anakin an eye-opening, and it's a bittersweet ending to the fic because it can slot nicely in as a Clone Wars story, because Obi-Wan regains his memories at the end. But that means that they lose the version of Obi-Wan that they had all kind of come to accept and appreciate. So it's a bittersweet ending, but it's not like a tragic story. And then last one I'm going to talk about real quick is a fic called Declarations. Oh no, wait. Two more fics. Sorry, my tabs are off in my show notes. So two more fics, real quick. Declarations by Knee11 and White Ethereal. It's a series exploring Obi-Wan and Ahsoka's relationship as Grand Master and Grand Padawan. That's a relationship we don't see very much of in Star Wars because of the tragedies of our main characters. Yoda trains Dooku, who turns to the dark side. Dooku trains Qui-Gon, who hates Dooku. Qui-Gon barely accepts training Obi-Wan. So they have a strained relationship. And Yoda meddled in Qui-Gon's life to get Obi-Wan as his apprentice. So they both kind of feel weird about that. And then Qui-Gon dies, so Anakin doesn't have any relationship with his Grandmaster. So the unit of Obi-Wan, Anakin, Ahsoka is like really the only time we see that as a kind of familial lineage in the Jedi Order. So it's Obi-Wan and Ahsoka. It's general fic. It's just stories about things that are happening in the Clone Wars, quiet moments in between the action, that kind of thing. It's really good. And it's ongoing. There's about 7 chapters. And then the last one, oh my god, this podcast is going to be so long. The last one is A Brother is Born for Adversity by TBLL57. And the summary on this series is a series following Remus Lupin over 4 phases in relationships, spying on Fenrir Greyback and the werewolves in the First War against Voldemort's forces, a chance reunion with Severus Snape in Paris 5 years after the war, where all is not as it seems, learning how to like each other again with Sirius after teaching Harry's 3rd year at Hogwarts, and back again to werewolves, this time with Bill Weasley hostage to Voldemort's agenda. Features the origins of the Order of the Phoenix, hitting rock bottom repeatedly and still trudging into work the next day, ambiguous mentoring from Albus Dumbledore, and learning to live with the monster inside. The last part of this fic is unfinished. The new Order of the Phoenix Harry Potter years, but it's a really good fic. It's a really good kind of gritty telling of Remus Lupin's life, and it throws you some really cool, interesting, weird twists. Or twists you wouldn't necessarily think about in the kind of joyfully oblivious nature of the adults in the Harry Potter books. But it's really, really good. So that's going to finally do it for this podcast, finally, after a bajillion hours. So show notes to everything are over at freakishlemon.com, including to all the fics I talked about. And come join us over at the Ravelry group, Freakish Lemon, in the groups tab. You'll find us. Come join the quilt along if you're interested. Come join the blanket along if you're working on a blanket. That's where all that stuff will be. You can follow me as Freakish Lemon at all the fun places like Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Ravelry. All the links to those things will be in the down bar here on YouTube or somewhere around here if you're watching this somewhere else. And if you are here on YouTube and you want to follow along with what I'm doing, consider hitting that subscribe button so you know when I post a new video on this channel. That's going to do it. I'm starting to lose my voice. So I'm going to say goodbye.